They said the Tijuana cartel was finished. Its leaders, men of blood and legend, either slain in carnage or rotting behind bars. But amidst that chaos, a serpent stirred in the shadows. Her name? La Jefa. The accountant who became Queen Pin, the woman who stitched together payrolls, prisons, and propaganda into an empire built on quiet calculation, not gunfire. Yet no one saw it coming. Most eyes fixate on the spectacle, guns, death, brutality, but power often lies where we least suspect it, in the quiet, in the ledger, in the woman who knows the numbers. Enadina Arellano Felix, La Jefa, stepped into the void left by her fallen brothers, not with bullets, but with balance sheets and alliances. She cleaned up chaos, recast the cartel's direction, and made it lean, lethal, and unstoppable in its silence. Behind the business suit and the spreadsheets lay a maze of deception. Pharmacy fronts. Hidden bank accounts. Whispered alliances with other cartels. While others fought in the streets, she fought in the boardroom, silent, strategic, and chillingly effective. Her reign was not about carnage, it was about continuity, profit, and the shell game of control, unseen but ironclad. Picture this, Tijuana's border crossings humming with traffic, reaching for the American dream, and each crossing freighted with more than dreams. Inside the cartel's hidden vault, cash flows as river runs, rolled into neat bundles, laundered through pharmacies, funneled through front companies. La Jefa watched it all, orchestrating payrolls so precise you'd swear it was a corporate operation, not a narco-enterprise. Then came something unexpected, prisons became her arenas. Behind metal bars, she deployed her influence as deftly as her brothers deployed men with guns. Contraband moved through guards' pockets, messages traveled in whispers, plans were born in solitary cells. She turned caged villains into puppet masters and forged loyalty through yellowed ledgers and unspoken debts. In there, she held dominion not by force, but by leverage. And as whispers of her power rippled outward, so did curated messages, narco corridos, propaganda videos, signed banners on street corners. The culture itself bent to her hand. Her story became a melody, one that both haunted and hypnotized. But how? How does a woman, trained in accounting, not armed, rise to become the ghost in a machine of violence? How did she orchestrate payrolls that funded hit squads, manipulate prisons where kings were born and broken, and shape propaganda that shaped reality? And now, the question hangs in the air, what happens when that kind of power is leveled against the very state itself? Stay with me, because next, we step inside her world, beyond the numbers, deeper into her domain.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
In the world of Mexico's cartels, women were rarely the ones making decisions. They were the wives, the sisters, the mothers, the silent observers of an empire drenched in blood. For decades, they cooked, cleaned, raised children, and pretended not to know where the money came from. But make no mistake, these women watched everything. And behind their silence lay a truth: they understood the system better than anyone, because they lived in its shadow. History remembers the men, the gunmen, the traffickers, the ruthless capos. But women were there, too, even if their names were whispered. There was Sandra Avila Beltran, the so-called Queen of the Pacific, whose elegance masked an empire of cocaine routes. There was Claudia Ochoa Felix, glamorized on Instagram before being branded the Empress of Anthrax. And there were countless others, unrecorded, unseen, who ferried messages, laundered money, bribed officials, and, when needed, pulled the trigger. These women were not ornaments. They were the quiet architects of survival. And then came the Arellano Felix family, once the undisputed rulers of Tijuana. 7 brothers, one by one, fell to bullets, betrayal, or prison bars. Their kingdom cracked under the weight of war with the Sinaloa cartel. Blood flooded the border streets. Allies turned against allies. The Tijuana cartel was a house of cards, collapsing in plain sight. But as the world looked to the men still standing, they overlooked someone waiting in the wings. Someone who understood numbers better than bullets. Her name was Enedina Arellano Felix. Born in Mazatlan, raised in Tijuana, she was not raised for violence, but for calculation. While her brothers learned the business of blood, Enedina studied accountancy. She attended college, kept her head low, and projected normalcy. She was the sister who took care of paperwork, balanced figures, and stayed invisible. But invisibility was her greatest weapon. While her brothers' names filled headlines, Enedina's name was absent. And that absence became her shield. She began as an assistant, tracking bribes, logging payments, laundering cash through pharmacies and real estate. Men dismissed her as the secretary. But she watched. She memorized. She calculated who was loyal, who was greedy, and who would sell out the family. Each ledger was more than numbers, it was a map of power. With every column she balanced, Enedina built a mental empire. And in silence, she grew indispensable. Then came the chaos of the 1990s. Her brothers were hunted like animals. Some captured, some killed, some betrayed. The old cartel hierarchy was collapsing. Meetings once filled with confident warlords now echoed with paranoia and fear. In that vacuum, Enedina stepped forward, not with guns, but with a single truth: without money, there is no cartel. She controlled the payrolls. She paid the hitmen. She bribed the officials. Without her, the war machine would grind to a halt. It was not her ambition to become queen. It was survival. If she didn't step up, the cartel would crumble, and she with it. But with every decision she made, her power grew undeniable. Soldiers once loyal only to her brothers now turned to her for orders. Politicians realized her signature carried more weight than a capo's threat. Rivals began to whisper a new name: La Jefa. The boss. But it wasn't just her steady hand that secured her place. It was one bold move, one act of defiance that shifted her from shadows to spotlight. In the middle of a crisis, with the cartel fractured and enemies closing in, Enedina made a decision so risky it could have destroyed her family, or saved it forever. That choice would cement her as the first true female leader of a Mexican cartel. If bullets are the noise of a cartel, money is the silence that sustains it. And in Tijuana, silence was La Jefa's weapon of choice. She didn't need to scream orders or spray bullets across border streets. All she needed was a pen, a ledger, and the knowledge that without her, thousands of men couldn't eat, bribe, or kill. Every peso, every dollar, every life in the organization flowed through her hands. Payroll. That was her empire's beating heart. Hitmen, drivers, lookouts, smugglers, corrupt officials, all lined up invisibly on her books. A sicario could disappear without hesitation if he wasn't paid. A policeman could turn enemy if his bribe went missing. La Jefa understood this. She orchestrated payroll like a symphony, every man, every roll, every peso carefully placed. Miss a note, and the whole orchestra turned against her. The money itself moved like water, untraceable, flowing through hidden channels. Pharmacies served as laundromats. Construction firms rose from dust, built nothing, and pocketed millions. Bars, nightclubs, even soccer clubs were infused with narco cash. On paper, they looked legitimate. In reality, they were arteries of blood money, pumping life into the cartel's body. Enedina didn't just manage these flows, she engineered them. But her brilliance lay not only in moving money, but in hiding it. Offshore accounts in the Caribbean. Shell companies in Panama. Coded ledgers that looked like shopping lists but were actually maps of million-dollar payments. Investigators would raid a property and find nothing but notebooks filled with groceries or birthdays. But to Enedina, those scribbles were empires. She wrote in codes only she could decipher, and without her key, law enforcement hit walls again and again. But money is never safe. It breeds envy, it breeds betrayal. And in the world of cartels, an accountant is as dangerous as a gunman, sometimes more. rival accountants began to vanish. One was found in the desert, bound and blindfolded, ledger pages scattered in the sand. Another disappeared after a routine meeting, his car abandoned on the highway. The message was clear: handle the money wrong, and you won't live long. Governments tried to follow the money. The DEA, Mexican intelligence, Interpol, each launched investigations. They froze accounts, raided businesses, seized shipments. But for every account they froze, 3 more appeared. For every shell company exposed, another was born overnight. It was like fighting a hydra: cut off one head, and 2 emerged. La Jefa's system was fluid, adaptable, and always 3 steps ahead of the law. And as investigators struggled, whispers grew: La Jefa wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her money didn't just keep her cartel afloat, it gave her leverage over rivals. Entire factions relied on her payroll. Entire police precincts bent to her bribes. Judges, customs officers, mayors, her money bought silence everywhere it touched. For many, her signature was more terrifying than a bullet. But money isn't only a tool, it's a weapon. La Jefa learned to weaponize scarcity. If loyalty wavered, if a soldier disobeyed, his payment vanished. If a politician demanded too much, their funding dried up. She didn't need to send sicarios with guns, she let hunger, fear, and financial ruin do her killing. Silent punishments, invisible assassinations. And they worked just as well as bullets. Yet as her financial empire expanded, so did the risks. Rivals began circling, watching her with suspicion. Government raids edged closer. Allies questioned her dominance. For all her control, Enadina realized money alone couldn't save her. Cash bought loyalty, but it couldn't contain chaos. It couldn't silence enemies forever. To survive the storm, she needed a new kind of power, one hidden behind walls of steel and concrete. But controlling the money wasn't enough. To survive, La Jefa had to control the prisons. Prisons in Mexico were never fortresses, they were marketplaces. Behind the steel doors and barbed wire, life continued with its own rules, its own economy. Food, drugs, phones, even weapons, all available if you knew who to pay. The guards looked the other way, wardens pocketed envelopes, and the cartels turned prisons into headquarters. For La Jefa, these walls were not a barrier. They were an opportunity. Cartel women had always played roles in keeping family members alive behind bars, sending money, food, clothing. But under La Jefa, the game changed. She didn't just support inmates. She controlled them. Smuggling phones became as essential as smuggling cocaine. With a phone, an inmate could order a hit, plan a shipment, or negotiate alliances. La Jefa ensured her faction had the best lines of communication, turning cells into offices and inmates into generals. But contraband wasn't just about phones. Cigarettes, liquor, cocaine, heroin, all flowed like a black river behind the walls. Even luxury goods made their way inside. For the right price, inmates had televisions, air conditioners, even gourmet meals. And behind every luxury was La Jefa's ledger. She orchestrated who got what, who was punished, and who was rewarded. She made herself the invisible warden, without ever wearing a badge. Her control reached beyond comfort. From behind bars, hits were ordered with precision. A guard bribed to look the other way. A rival dragged into the showers, never to return. Guards told one story: chaos, gangs too powerful to resist. Inmates told another, a world where La Jefa's faction ruled like a government. Her reach extended into every corridor, every cell block. The prison walls were not protecting society from criminals, they were protecting La Jefa's empire from the outside world. Then came the riot. In one notorious prison, tensions boiled over between rival factions. At first, it was fists and shouting. Then came the blades, the fire, the chaos. Guards barricaded themselves in offices, terrified. Inmates seized control of entire wings, flying banners of allegiance. When the smoke cleared, dozens were dead, hundreds wounded. Officials blamed poor security. survivors whispered a different truth, that the riot had been orchestrated. That it was La Jefa's faction flexing its power. Testimonies diverged. Guards claimed they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Inmates said they were pawns in a game far bigger than themselves. Some insisted the riot wasn't spontaneous, it was a demonstration of dominance. Every life lost was a warning. Every scream was a message. And behind it all, they whispered, was the silent accountant, La Jefa, who pulled strings from beyond the bars. The aftermath was brutal. Families crowded outside prison gates, desperate for news. Officials promised investigations. But inside, little changed. La Jefa's influence only deepened. She had shown that even the state's most fortified institutions were not beyond her reach. To some inmates, she was protector. To others, executioner. But to all, she was the one who decided life or death within those walls. Her reputation spread. She was no longer seen as just a woman behind the money. She was feared as the invisible warden. Wardens who resisted her influence were replaced. Guards who crossed her were silenced. Politicians who asked too many questions were bribed or disappeared. She had mastered not only the cartel's finances, but its prisons. And with that, her legend grew darker, heavier, and far more dangerous. Yet for all her reach, for all the steel and concrete that bowed to her will, there remained one truth: prisons were only part of the empire. To dominate fully, La Jefa needed something more. Not just money. Not just soldiers. Not just cells. She needed to command perception itself. To control what people believed, feared, and obeyed. Still, power behind bars wasn't enough. Outside, a new weapon was emerging: propaganda. The bullet is loud. The machete is brutal. But propaganda? Propaganda is eternal. By the late 2000s, La Jefa understood what many cartel leaders never grasped: control wasn't just about violence, it was about narrative. The stories told on street corners, in newspapers, in music, in whispers late at night. And she would make those stories her own. It began with narco-mantas, giant banners strung across bridges and highways. They weren't crude warnings anymore. Under La Jefa, they became polished statements, carefully written, sometimes even signed like official communiques. Messages that blamed rivals, threatened politicians, or promised protection to local neighborhoods. Each one was propaganda, a chess move in a war of perception. Then came the songs. Narco-corridos, ballads once sung in back rooms, now echoed across radios and parties. La Jefa ensured that her story, her cartel, her victories, were immortalized in music. Accordions played, guitars strummed, singers told tales of a woman who rose above men, who ruled not with an iron fist but with invisible power. Myths and melodies became as deadly as bullets. But she didn't stop at songs. She adapted to the new world. Cartel propaganda now leaked through social media: videos, grainy clips of armed men, slick montages set to music, even staged community aid drives. A carefully crafted image of benevolence, handing out food baskets, paying for school supplies, helping the poor. Every video carried the same unspoken message: the government abandons you, but La Jefa does not. Governments panicked. How do you fight a war not just on the streets, but in the minds of millions? For every raid, every capture, every headline, La Jefa's faction responded with counter-narratives. A banner discredited the government. A song mocked their failure. A video painted her cartel as saviors. She was no longer a name in shadows, she was a voice that the state could not silence. Even rivals began to fear her differently. They didn't whisper about her soldiers, or her firepower. They whispered about her influence. How a single message could make a town loyal, how a single corrido could turn her into a folk hero. She didn't need to fire bullets to win ground. She weaponized belief itself. And in cartel wars, belief can kill faster than any gun. But with influence came enemies. Old rivals in Sinaloa, splinter factions in Juarez, even allies inside her own organization began to watch her rise with suspicion. Her power wasn't loud, but it was growing. And in the underworld, nothing breeds betrayal faster than success. Whispers spread of betrayals being plotted. Secret meetings where her rivals spoke of cutting the head off the serpent. Deals struck with corrupt officials to weaken her grip. Even family ties frayed. The very people who once depended on her numbers now plotted to erase her name from the books. And so, the Queen of Ledgers and Letters found herself in a new kind of war. Not the kind fought with bullets, but the kind fought with betrayal. Every phone call could be a setup. Every ally, a traitor. Every message, a trap. She had risen higher than most dared dream. But the higher she climbed, the steeper the fall that awaited her. But the higher Jefa climbed, the more enemies gathered below, waiting for their chance. For years, Jefa had been untouchable. Her empire was built on numbers, not headlines. But power never stays invisible forever. Whispers of her name reached too many ears, politicians, generals, and foreign agents. Soon, the walls began to close in. The DEA, Interpol, and the Mexican Marines all started circling. Jefa was no longer the accountant in the shadows. She was a target. International agencies studied her like a puzzle. Phone records, money trails, intercepted shipments, every clue was a thread in the web. They knew she wasn't a sicario. She didn't carry a gun. But they understood her power. The woman who kept the cartel solvent was more dangerous than 1,000 soldiers. But the greatest danger didn't come from governments. It came from within. Allies began to shift. Cartel leaders who once relied on her payroll now resented her influence. Some feared she knew too much. Others wanted her seat at the table. And in the underworld, betrayal is currency. Phone calls began to change tone. Intercepted messages revealed paranoia. Is she with us, or against us? One voice asked. Another warned, if she falls, we all fall. But paranoia is contagious. Soon, her rivals whispered to authorities, feeding just enough information to set traps. Raids began, first on warehouses, then safe houses. Marines stormed compounds at dawn. Helicopters circled border towns. Each time, Jefa slipped away. Some said she was warned by officials on her payroll. Others swore she simply moved too carefully, vanishing hours before each raid. But escape bred suspicion. Rivals accused her of cutting deals. Allies accused her of betrayal. Her name carried power, but also a price. Every safe house she entered felt more like a cage. Every convoy, a potential ambush. Trust drained from her empire like water from a cracked glass. Then came the breaking point. Some say it was an ambush, a convoy intercepted on a mountain road, bullets tearing through the night. Others claim it was a quiet betrayal, her location sold to the highest bidder. And some believe she staged it all herself, disappearing into the mist, leaving enemies and allies chasing a ghost. Official reports are vague. Some say she was captured and flown to a secret prison. Others insist there was never a body, never an arrest photo, never fingerprints to prove the state's victory. A shadow vanishing leaves only questions, and in the cartel world, unanswered questions become legends. Whispers spread fast. Did the government silence her because she knew too much? Did her rivals eliminate her in a coup? Or did she vanish willingly, retreating into anonymity while her systems kept running? Nobody knew. And that was the genius of Jefa, her power lived in structures, not in her presence. Even in her downfall, whispers of Jefa's shadow remain, because money, prisons, and propaganda don't die with one arrest. They live on, like ghosts in the wires, like ink on paper, like fear in the streets. Jefa's story didn't end with handcuffs or a bullet. Her true legacy is written in the blueprints she left behind. While most cartel bosses chased blood and headlines, she carved a quieter model of power, one that lived in ledgers, prisons, and whispers. Today, cartels across Mexico study her methods like scripture. Her model of leadership reshaped the underworld. Violence still ruled, but it no longer stood alone. Payrolls became weapons, propaganda became armor, and prisons became outposts of power. La Jefa proved you didn't need to fire a shot to control an empire, you just needed to control the money and the message. And others took notice. More women began to rise, not as gunfighters, but as administrators, negotiators, propagandists. Sisters, wives, accountants, lawyers, all stepping into roles once reserved for men. They learned from La Jefa's playbook: move quietly, build loyalty through resources, and keep control hidden in the folds of paperwork and culture. Culturally, she became something between myth and ghost. Narco ballads still tell her story, blending fact with legend. Some paint her as a ruthless queen who outsmarted governments. Others describe her as a protector of her people. And on TikTok, short videos romanticize her power, portraying her as untouchable, immortal, still whispering orders from the shadows. Governments, too, feel her echo. Even in cases where she has vanished from the headlines, officials admit that her strategies outlived her presence. Cartel payroll systems remain nearly impossible to untangle. Prisons remain more cartel-run than state-run. And propaganda floods communities faster than official news. Her fingerprints, faint but unmistakable, remain on every layer of the underworld. But her greatest trick may have been her disappearance. Unlike many cartel leaders, there is no iconic capture moment replayed on television, no dramatic shootout etched in memory. La Jefa simply faded. For some, she was gone, retired, imprisoned quietly, or dead. For others, the silence itself was proof that she had won. Because if no one can say where you are, then maybe you are everywhere. And so the legend lingers. In every prison riot, every cartel banner, every corrido sung in a smoky cantina, her ghost walks. Some claim she left the game. Others swear she still runs operations through proxies, her hand invisible but unmistakable. Perhaps the accountant queen became too valuable to disappear. Perhaps she still sits in the shadows, pen in hand, ledger open. Some say La Jefa is gone. Others say she's still out there, running payrolls, prisons, and propaganda, from the shadows. And so, the legend of La Jefa fades into the smoke of history, or perhaps, into the silence of tomorrow. Her empire of payrolls, prisons, and propaganda may have shifted hands, but her blueprint still lingers, etched into the underworld like scars that never heal. Some say she is gone. Others whisper she is still pulling strings, her voice echoing in corridors of power, her shadow passing quietly through prison walls, her hand counting stacks of money no one dares to trace. What is certain is that La Jefa proved one truth: in the cartel world, power is not always carried at the end of a gun. Sometimes, it hides in a pen, a whisper, a rumor. And those whispers will outlive us all. If you want more untold stories like this, subscribe for tomorrow's deep dive. Because in the world of crime, truth is always stranger and darker than fiction. Don't believe what they say. I never left.